I would like to say a warm welcome to everyone. My name is Merve Ispahani. I'm the Academic Programs Coordinator at Columbia Global Centers, Istanbul. Today, we are delighted to host our fourth webinar on ideologies and transnational networks as part of our program on Voices of Emerging Scholars. We believe in the importance of creating ongoing scholarly conversations on global scale, and we cannot wait to hear more about the research of our guest speakers today. We will have a Q&A session after the presentations, so please feel free to post your questions on the Q&A box. Let me leave the word to Professor Zeynep Çelik to introduce you to our panelists and today's program. Thank you.
Welcome to our fourth webinar, Ideologies and Transregional Networks, circa 1920. As always, I'm grateful to İpek Cemtaha, the director of the Columbia Center in Istanbul, to Merve Tezcanlı İspahani, academic programs coordinator, and to Seden Gürlek, the program officer. I thank Andrew Hammond, Burak Sayım, and Orçun Okan for their very fine papers and for their collaboration in following our cumbersome preparation process. Finally, I would like to thank Professor Eugene Rogan for graciously accepting to be our discussant. Today's papers came together seamlessly. The eventful developments they cover happened within a very short period, within a few years that followed World War I. They took place in a region that extends from the former Arab provinces of the empire through Anatolia to the Soviet Union. Focusing on this geography, which is hardly ever considered as an entity, the speakers expose us to significant discussions on ideology, policymaking, nation formation, and international solidarity networks. Andrew Hammond reveals a dialogue between Islamist rationalists and Kemalists provoked by a British inquiry. Burak Sayım charts a map of the crisscrossings of communists from Iraq and Syria to Anatolia and the Soviet Union. Orçun Okan scrutinizes the impact of the Treaty of Lausanne on the post-Ottoman Middle East, deconstructing the common vision that it was consequential only for Turkey. The discussions are tied together by the Treaty of Lausanne, the foundation of the Turkish Republic, and a specter that was haunting the Middle East and causing much anxiety to Western powers, the Soviet Union. Ottoman modernity and its infrastructure, which we encountered in the earlier webinars, are present here again, with the post office, telegraph service, railroads, and ports in the background, working hard and enabling communication and travel. We can trace other continuing threads, this time even an individual we already met in our previous discussion. Once again, I would like to draw your attention to the wealth of the sources tapped by the presenters. Our list of archives is growing longer with the addition of several French state archives, the Russian State Archive of Socio-Political History, those of the Turkish Red Crescent, British and American National Archives, the newly opened archives of the Turkish Communist Party, as well as special collections in university libraries. The list of journals is also extending into a multilinguistic and multi-ideological collection, ranging from the Islamist rationalist Rebiül Reşat in Turkish to communist İştirak and İnsaniyet in Arabic. Let me now introduce our speakers and our discussant. Andrew Hammond obtained his doctorate from the University of Oxford in 2020 for his thesis, Interactions between Turkish and Egyptian Islamic Thinkers from 1908 to 1952, Modernity and the Disruption of Islamic Knowledge. The manuscript is currently at the peer review stage for publication. Dr. Hammond studied Arabic and early Islamic history at SOAS and modern Middle East studies and Turkish at Oxford. He worked previously as a journalist for Reuters in Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Over the past year, he has taught late Ottoman and modern Turkish history and Turkish political and cultural texts at Oxford. Burak Sayım is a PhD candidate at the International History Department of the Graduate Institute in Geneva. He completed his bachelor's degree at the University of Istanbul and his master's degree at the University of Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. He's currently working on his doctoral dissertation, provisionally titled Transnational Communist Networks in the Post-World War I Middle East, Anti-Colonialism, Internationalism, and Itinerant Militancy, 1919-1928. Orçun Can Okan received his PhD in history from Columbia University in 2020 with a dissertation titled Coping with Transitions, the Connected Construction of Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, 1918-1928. He is currently a postdoctoral research fellow in global history and governance at the University of Naples. Dr. Okan's research combines methods of diplomatic history with social history in order to analyze questions of nationality and citizenship, imperial collapse, and state succession in the aftermath of World War I. Our discussant, Eugene Rogan, is a professor of modern Middle East history at the University of Oxford and a fellow of St. Anthony's College, where he serves as director of the Middle East Center. He was elected a fellow of the British Academy in 2017. He received his BA in economics from Columbia and his MA and PhD from Harvard in history and Middle Eastern studies. His work focuses on the Arab world from the late Ottoman era to modern times. He is the author of Frontiers of State in the Late Ottoman Empire, Transjordan 1851-1920, published in 1999. The Arabs, a History, published in 2009 and again in 2017, and most recently, The Fall of the Ottomans, The Great War in the Middle East, 1914-1920, published in 2015. His books have been translated into 18 languages. Now I'm passing the word on to Andrew.
Hello. This paper is titled The Anglican Church Affair, the Brief Rise and Fall of the Ottoman Islamists at the Inception of the Turkish Republic. On 21st December 1918, several weeks after the Ottoman defeat in the First World War, a letter from a civil servant of the British government's Charity Commission arrived at the office of the Grand Mufti in Istanbul with a special request. An authoritative book of 30,000 words explaining Islam to the West, be authored by a prominent personage and placed in a special collection of the Anglican Church Library. This book should address 4 questions. What is the religion of the Prophet? What is this religion's contribution to thought and life? What is its solution to the various troubles of our times? And what does it have to say about the political and spiritual forces currently transforming the world for good or for bad? No copy of the original letter in English has been found in the Muftiluk archives in Istanbul, in Church of England archives, or among the private papers of the man who sent the letter, an English public intellectual by the name of Arthur Bootwood, whose identity it has only now been possible to establish. Previously, we only knew of Bootwood's name through 2 Ottoman translations of his letter, published separately in 1919 and 1923 by 2 members of the Darul Hikmet al-Islamiyye, the, at the time, recently established Islamic Research Academy of senior ulama and devout Muslim intellectuals, that the Grand Mufti Haidarizade Ibrahim had charged with providing a reply. Butwood's book request was taken seriously by the Ottoman religious establishment, the Ilmiye, for two reasons. It was misunderstood to have come from the head of the Anglican Church himself, and it happened to coincide with the onset of the British occupation of Istanbul. After long deliberations over who should author the response, the Mufti chose Izmirli Ismail Hakkı, who was working at the time on a study aiming to harmonize Islamic theology with recent Western philosophical trends. From Butwood's private papers, which are held at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge, we now know that sometime in 1920, Butwood received what appears to have been the first section of Hakkı's planned book, and that Butwood had planned, never realized, for British Muslim leader Sayyid Amir Ali to write the preface to various editions in English, Persian, Urdu, and Arabic. However, not all members of the Islamic Research Academy were happy with the idea of responding to this British request. Said Nursi, the religious scholar who was to become a seminal figure of Turkish Republican Islam, immediately understood it as an effort by the occupying victor in the First World War to co-opt the Ottoman Muslim authorities. Nursi later stated on two occasions in his Risale-i-Nur compendium that he had refused any involvement in the project from the outset. However, he did provide a retort of sorts in his pamphlet Rumuz, Signs, published in 1920, which included a section titled Bir Papaza Cevap, Response to a Priest. Nursi wrote, and I quote, "A man tries to kill you, throwing you to the ground and putting his foot on your throat. Then he asks you contemptuously about your religion. The way to silence him is to go quiet in anger, then spit in his face." Nursi then offered four terse answers to Butwood's questions. He wrote, "What is the religion of Muhammad, the Quran? What did it give to thought and life, the unicity of God and guidance? What is its cures for the troubles, mizahim," he wrote, "prevention of usury and the obligatory alms, zakat? What does it say about this turmoil, shuzalzaleh, that man will be judged by his efforts as will those who amass wealth?" He's taking there the two Quranic verses, "Laysa lil insan illa ma sa'a" and "Alladhina yaknizuna dahab." There is some evidence in Butwood's papers that appears to justify Nursi's concerns. Another Academy member, Eshraf Efendizade Shafkati, wrote to Butwood independently requesting clarification of the intent behind his questions. In his book, Sa'i ve Sarmayi Mujadalatan and Dinan Surati Halli, Religion's Solution to the Conflict Between Labor and Capital, Shafkati translates the answer he received in April 1921, a part of which is also preserved in the Butwood archive. Butwood is clearly concerned about how the Ottoman government would react to communism in the wake of the Russian Revolution. He discusses rising working class consciousness in the West, as a result of which, quote, "Lenin has friends in every land," which appears in the Ottoman translation as "Lenin in her memleketi dostları var." In other correspondence with acquaintances in Britain, written in January and May 1921, Butwood said he hoped the book he had requested on Islam would help change the views of British Prime Minister Lloyd George, who was strongly pro-Greek in the divided British government during the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922. Butwood wanted him to realize that the caliph was not a pope with authority in matters of faith. Thus, Turkey's retention of the caliphate, as well as the vilayets of Smyrna and eastern Thrace, need not be considered problematic. Butwood often expressed the fear to his interlocutors, who included British and Indian Muslim leaders and Ottoman Turkish diplomats, that British government policy was putting the integrity of its empire at risk through stoking resentment amongst Muslims. As the author of numerous books on questions of religion, education, and national renewal under the pen name Haklut Egerton, Butwood also worried that both Western writing on Islam and Muslim writing influenced by Western thinking had distorted the truth about Muslim faith. This truth, he hoped to show, was that Islam retained the spirituality he felt Europe was losing due to post-Enlightenment materialist and positivist thought. In his letter of December 1918, the original letter to the Grand Mufti, he said he wanted to hear the East speak for itself, Ende Cecile, rather than through those whose minds are, quote, filled with the most modern culture, which comes out in the Turkish as en asri bir harçla zihinleri doldurulmuş kimseler. And yet, commenting on the arrival of Hakkı's first installment in a letter to Britain's Chief Charity Commissioner, Butchwood noticed with amusement that it was addressed to the Archbishop of Canterbury, while deriding it as, quote, a piece of Islamic propaganda. Propaganda that he could not yet have digested since it was in Turkish. Butchwood made no mention in his letters of his working for the British government, stating simply he had been assigned to the Anglican Library project, by whom he doesn't say. At the time, there was no shortage of English language materials explaining Islam, though perhaps of too apologetic in nature in Butchwood's view. Whatever his motives, Butchwood's interest seems to have flagged as political realities shifted. The Anglican Church affair was now to acquire new life on the Turkish side, just at the point when Ankara's nationalist forces were poised to make their final victory against the Greek occupation, wrest control of Istanbul from the rival government of the Sultan, and enter the Lausanne peace talks with Britain, France, and Italy in 1922. Mustafa Kemal's government appears to have seized on the idea of publishing a grand description of Islam in the form of a new response to the Anglican Church as a prestigious state project that would bolster Mustafa Kemal as national unifier of political factions, including Islamic opinion in the country, and raise Ankara's status internationally as the leading state amongst Muslim nations. Declaring the response of the Istanbul religious authorities and Hakkı to have been inadequate, Parliament, the Ankara Parliament in August 1922, charged the recently formed Publications and Research Committee of the Ministry of Sharia and Religious Endowments with authoring a new book. However, rather than choose someone from within the Ottoman religious establishment to write it, Mustafa Kemal's Prime Minister, Hüseyin Rauf Orbay, turned to Egyptian religious scholar Abdulaziz Jawish, a familiar figure who the wartime CUP government had sent to Germany to work on propaganda operations. Jawish was brought from Munich to not only write the book, but head the publications committee itself. And leading poet and devout intellectual Mehmet Akif, who had worked with Jawish on the same wartime mission and authored Ankara's recently chosen national anthem, was commissioned to translate Jawish's Arabic text into Turkish. Mustafa Kemal would praise the committee in a speech before Parliament in March 1923, describing it as working on a project to put together a special library of its own through gathering books from Europe, Istanbul, and Egypt to allow comparative studies on Western and Muslim societies, their religious beliefs, philosophy, and economy. That year, the new response to the Anglican Church was finally published, as in Turkish Anglikan Kilisesini Cevap, and in Arabic as Ajwibati fil Islam and Asilatul Kanisal Anglikaniya. And it was also serialized between July 1923 and February 1924 in Sabila Rashad, the leading Islamic journal of which Akif was co-editor. Sabila Rashad would hail the work as consonant with the great progress of the era, as it said, capable of providing solutions to modern problems and gaining Islamic prestige for Turkey. Both Jawish's book and the final book that Hakkı did publish in Turkey appear never to have been sent to Britain. But in Jawish's case, that was never really the true intent. It is, in many ways, the apologia that Butchwood hoped to avoid, in that Jawish gives a quintessential modernist defense of Islam as a modern world religion. Christian missionaries, he says, have depicted Islam as blind submission to God without independent thought or agency, but Islamic faith is predicated upon reason. The Quran is Islam's only miracle, and Islam does not expect people to accept impossible beliefs or rules which defy proof. This form of rationality encompasses individual freedom of conscience, which means equality of responsibility for actions between men and women and amongst different classes and political entities, while the obligation to perform the rites and rituals such as prayer and fasting are an individual responsibility based on the Quranic principle of exoneration from original sin. Muslims are called to labor and effort, sa'i ve mujahede, not to accept fatalistic notions of divine predetermination of human affairs, an idea the book blames on Sufism. These are all typical themes of the modernist movement. At the same time, the text sought to present Islam with a distinct modern religious identity of its own. building on ideas that late Ottoman Muslim intellectuals such as Akif, Hakke, Ahmed Naim, Namik Kemal, Abdurrashid Ibrahim, and wartime Prime Minister Said Halim Pasha had developed. For example, it says Islam is comprehensive in its prescriptions for all aspects of modern life, which you get in Said Halim's writing. It says its intellectual tradition can perfectly well engage with Western philosophy of the Enlightenment era, which is what Ismail Haqqi wrote about. And it partakes of a unique egalitarian transnational identity, which is what Ahmed Naim specifically wrote about. The book was also adamant in defending the Hanafi legal position on the rights and duties of women, arguing that various European jurisdictions are deficient in areas such as property rights, and it pointed to various forms of dysfunction in the Western democracies of the time. It also advanced a critique of the West that linked specifically European discourse on Islam to imperial designs on territory, which you get in the writing hints of in Namik Kemal, Abdurrashid Ibrahim, and Mehmet Akif. Douish writes in one passage very directly, whenever there was something they wanted in the Islamic world, they arrived at their colonial aims through this form of attack. And yet, the high hopes of the Muslim intellectuals in the summer of 1922 that the Ottoman state would re-emerge as a revitalized Islamic polity were to be quickly dashed. Douish first realized the government's intent to create a completely new political, legal, and social system after 2 long discussions, one with Mustafa Kemal in December 1922, and a second with a group of unnamed members of his inner circle in January 1923, in which he was pressed on a range of issues, including the infamous call to jihad of 1914, the need or otherwise for a caliphate, the viability of rendering it a purely spiritual office, and the possibility of parliament assuming the caliph's functions. Douish left for Egypt in November 1923 after the Publications Committee was closed down and Turkey declared a republic. Akif followed him in 1925 during a time of revolutionary tribunals and the closure of Sabila Rashad. The caliphate was finally abolished in March 1924, inaugurating a series of radical reforms, repositioning both religious institutions and religious faith in the new secularizing society. Overall, this curious affair speaks on the one hand to the ongoing debate over Mustafa Kemal's intentions. He had shocked a British journalist in late 1922 with a denunciation of Turkish society as a priest-ridden, quote, priest-ridden nation. The revamping of the response to the Anglican Church as a manifesto for modern Islam served government purposes during Lausanne, before the treaty was finalized in July 1923. On the other hand, this affair strengthens the view that Kemalism put an abrupt end to the early elaboration in the late Ottoman milieu of an Islamist political project involving the construction of Islam as an ideology, a project that would be pursued in Egypt and Pakistan in the subsequent decades before it was finally revisited in Turkey. Thank you. I will now pass over to Burak.
Thank you, Andrew, and hi, everyone. The title of my paper is Beyond Borders, an Entangled History of Communism in the Post-Ottoman Middle East. In 1922, Soviet citizen Mikhail Borisovich Golman penned one last report from Ankara. In the very last part, he elaborated on how the Communist International could smuggle material and people from Anatolia to Syria and Iraq. After concluding that passing the frontier by carts proved easier than the seaborne journey, he noted, and I quote, "The night comes and all Turkey is fast asleep, including the policemen and the border control. From 11 p.m. to 4 a.m., the power in Anatolia belongs to the Communist Party of Turkey and the occasional poor passers-by." End quote. Goldman's attention to the practicalities of crossing the newly formed borders separating Turkey from its southern neighbors was no coincidence. Goldman, a revolutionary militant since the early 1910s and a Bolshevik since 1917, was seasoned in the intricacies of communist underground activity. He was coming to the end of his mission as the special Comintern envoy for the Ankara-based People's Communist Party of Turkey, or TİV, and he had spent the better part of the year composing a political apparatus capable of forging ties with Bilad-ul-Sham and Iraq. And it was a muscular engagement. Under his leadership, at one point, 6 out of the 13 Central Committee members of TİV were charged with missions concerning Iraq and Syria. As a part of this all-out commitment to reach Syria, Mehmet Hasip, a candidate member of the TİV Central Committee, took a trip to Damascus in early 1922. The choice of Mehmet Hasip, who, by the way, went by the nom de guerre Shuaib within the party, for this exploratory mission demonstrates the resilience of the radical ties forged in the late Ottoman era and their importance for ensuing communist militancy. As a newly minted communist, Shuaib was not well versed in the Marxist theory. He had read some Proudhon, even less Marx, as he stated, but he was well connected. His father, born in Dagestan, was exiled to Syria by Abdülhamid II after siding with Ali Suavi's foiled coup attempt in 1878. Mehmet Hasip himself was born in Damascus during his father's exile days. Then, as a student in the imperial capital, he took part in the Young Turk movement and had to leave the city and move to Ankara in 1896 to avoid persecution by the government. In the wake of the 1908 revolution, Mehmet Hasip returned to the capital and joined the İştirak journal, which functioned as the incubator of the Ottoman Socialist Party. Then, once again, he was Ankara-bound, where he collaborated with the socialist paper İnsaniyet, which replaced the banned İştirak. And İnsaniyet, just like its namesake in Syria evoked by Alice Gary in the last session, was named after the eminent French socialist daily L'Humanité. Following a political hiatus during the Great War, Shuaib joined the People's Communist Party of Turkey, in his words, after the Anatolian Revolution began. Both his Damascene origins and his stints in the pre-Comintern Ottoman socialism made him ideally situated to undertake this mission. Indeed, he seemed to have taken particular pride in his role at İştirak. Although he was by then a candidate member of the Central Committee of TİV, he signed some of his party correspondence not with this title, but as a former collaborator of İştirak. The connections he forged in Istanbul and beyond would come in handy. In a letter about his mission, Shuaib pointed out that he was originally from Syria and knew many people there. He had family in Damascus, Beirut, and Assad. Not just family, old comrades of sorts too. Dr. Gilfar Naci, who's an engineer in the Syrian railways, lawyer Hijaz, İzzetzadeh, dentist Supi, and so on, he said. Some of them were Arab nationalists, as he explained, and others were his old İştirak colleagues. They now lived in different nation-states in the making, but the radical ties forged in the imperial capital died hard. Shuaib left Ankara on March 13, 1922, and arrived in Damascus via Adana. His tasks were bold, if not overambitious. It included, among many others, and I quote, to help out the liberation struggles in Egypt, Mesopotamia, Hijaz, and particularly in Palestine against the English, conduct communist propaganda within the longshoremen, railway and tram workers, as well as students and low-rank civil servants, end quote. Notwithstanding, or rather precisely due to the initial expectations, Shuaib's mission stood very little chance of living up to the hype. Indeed, just a few months after his appointment, the French occupiers in Syria got wind of his mission. His identity was exposed, leading the party to replace him with another militant named Bekir. Nonetheless, his networks did pay off, and his mission must have had some success, as in August 1922, 3 Syrian communists, a merchant from Aleppo, a journalist, and a mechanic, reached Mersin with a letter from Shuaib. To be clear, Shuaib's mission fell short of expectations. But it was not the only card that the communists had in their sleeve to forge ties across the post-Ottoman Middle East. Their efforts were oriented in two directions. The first was Iraq, and more particularly, the city of Mosul. The city, along with Damascus, was supposed to be represented at a communist-led Congress of Turkish trade unions, indicating the extent to which the post-Ottoman Middle East was entangled with Anatolia in the Comintern strategy of the early 1920s. A Mardin-based center was established, or at least designed, to facilitate communications with Mosul. And around that time, the internal correspondence of Anatolian communists mentioned Iraqi candidate members to the Communist Party of Turkey. Goldman and the Comintern had high hopes for Çukurova and particularly for Mersin more than anywhere else. The town had several assets, making it stand out as a fertile ground for communist network building. While still under the control of Turkish forces, it was conveniently situated not far away from Aleppo, which was at the epicenter of the Hanan revolt against the French occupation until 1921. It also had a modern port from the late 19th century and provided easy access to nearby harbors such as Beirut, which was the new gravitation point of Bled el-Sham. And the Cominternians had every intention to capitalize on these maritime connections. The reports they sent to Moscow indicated plans to buy a vessel to establish regular communication between Mersin and Syrian ports. Just as important, Mersin was still home to a sizable Arab population, and its ties with the former Arabic vilayets of the empire endured. This phenomenon was only too visible within the TİHİV organization itself. At the 1922 Congress of the party, 3 of the 4 delegates from Çukurova town spoke Arabic, and 2 of them listed Syria as the foreign country that they were familiar with. And for comparison, it's worth underlining that only 1 delegate out of the remaining 14 spoke Arabic, and none had any familiarity with Syria. Last but not least, Mersin was a working-class town where the communists carried some clout. Salih Hacıoğlu, who, by the way, will be a future victim of the Stalinist purge and the protagonist of an acerbic poem directed against Stalinism by Nazım Hikmet, was charged with laying the groundwork for a Mersin center which would connect Anatolian communists with Syria. His superiors praised his efficiency at this task, and this success propelled him to the top position in the party at the 1922 Congress. In fact, the intention was to form a fully functioning apparatus in the town. An Arabic language paper was to be published under the title of Kuvayi Milliye, in an uncanny reference to the national liberation fight going on in Anatolia. Moreover, Goldman urged the Comintern to quickly dispatch 3 to 5 French and British communists to Mersin to take the lead of defeatist propaganda towards the French and British troops occupying Bled el-Sham. He reckoned that this Mersin center could fulfill a similar function as the International Propaganda Center did in Odessa between 1918 and 1919, which supported the French Black Sea Navy mutiny against a military intervention targeting the Soviet power. Although the British and French militants that Goldman requested probably never arrived, Mersin effectively served as a hinge between the Cominternians in Anatolia and different strands of Arab national liberation movements. TİHİV itself created a committee for Syrian national liberation after a meeting with exiled Syrian nationalists in Adana. The committee's pied-à-terre was in Mersin, and the Kuvayi Milliye paper was to be its primary publication. Moreover, in the neighboring Tarsus, the communists had discussions with the Libyan Sheikh Sunusi, who was a close ally of Mustafa Kemal, with their contacts dating back to the 1911 Turco-Italian War. In these discussions, the Comintern promised to support Sunusi in his struggle against the British. Sunusi, in his turn, responded by saying how much he appreciated the Bolsheviks as opposed to the other European powers. And less than a week later, the Comintern Center in Moscow received a glowing report on Sunusi from Mersin, commending his anti-colonial credentials. And even though the exact content of his activity in the town is not clear, Shekip Arslan, one of the most prominent standard bearers of Syrian nationalism during the interwar years, also spent intermittent periods in Mersin between 1923 and 1925. That is to say, after his initial visit to Moscow in 1921 and immediately before starting discussions with the Palestinian and French Communist parties in Geneva. Consequently, Arslan took part in the founding congress of the Comintern-linked League Against Imperialism in Brussels as the Syrian representative. These accounts do tell us several things about radical post-Ottoman connections across the borders of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. As Sir Sheikh argued, the decade following the Great War unfolded as a long Ottoman twilight in the region. New national borders rose, but the extant social ties and radical political connections showed remarkable resilience. Intra-imperial radical ties established in the last decades of Ottoman Empire did not vanish, and at least some of them persisted under a new transnational form. The post-Ottoman Middle East became a site of entangled communist militancy. Overlapping layers of interconnectedness made the post-Ottoman Middle East a particularly eloquent example of an entangled communist habitus. Militants showed remarkable fluidity in operating across national borders. And the Anatolia-Syria axis was but one example of the entangled world of post-Ottoman communist militancy. For instance, in 1924, the Comintern opted for Thessaloniki as its planned Near Eastern center. It will supply the Near Eastern seaports with communist publications in Turkish and Arabic through comrade sailors. The seaports to be served were almost exclusively former Ottoman cities and included Istanbul, Izmir, Iskenderun, Beirut, Haifa, Jaffa, and Alexandria. Just like Mersin, Thessaloniki, by the way, arguably the birthplace of Ottoman socialism, stood out for the Communist International as a place that would rely on post-Ottoman connections. The paper trail concerning the center goes cold in the Comintern archives after the initial draft. However, as late as 1928, Italian sources indicate mounting concerns about the Thessaloniki Communist Center supplying communists in Alexandria with propaganda material. Finally, I would like to conclude this fragment of history on another axis, this time between Syria and Palestine. 2.5 years after the Shuaib's Damascus mission, in October 1924, Palestinian communists took a stab at organizing the Syrian revolutionaries. Shuaib's mission had not achieved any substantial breakthrough in organizing the Syrian revolutionaries. Palestinians, on the other hand, fared better. Following their endeavor, finally, in 1926, a de facto First Congress of the Communist Party of Syria brought 6 Arabic, 8 Armenian, 1 Jewish, and 1 Turkish delegate together. Among them, by the way, Fuad al-Shemali from El-Iskeri's presentation. And according to the minutes of the Congress, the delegates represented a dozen Bilad al-Sham cities, but also 2 Iraqi ones, namely Mosul and Baghdad, befittingly showing how entangled the history of communist militancy in the post-Ottoman Middle East was. Thank you, everyone, and the floor is all yours, Orçun.
Thank you very much, Burak. I'll be presenting my paper titled The Treaty of Lausanne and the Construction of the Arab East. The Treaty of Lausanne was the peace treaty signed between Turkey and the Allies in July 1923. As stated in the treaty's preamble, it was signed with the desire to end, quote, the state of war which has existed in the East since 1914, end quote. There is by now a large and highly useful body of scholarship on this treaty. However, sufficient attention is yet to be invested into its role in a laborious process that continued in multiple countries throughout and beyond the 1920s, the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire. In what follows, I will explain and emphasize this point with reference to specific articles in the treaty, with a focus on Turkey and its southeastern neighbors in the 1920s, the French and British mandates in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. In the immediate aftermath of the Ottoman demise, Inhabitants of former Ottoman domains were still linked to the Ottoman past through their relations to the former state, to each other, and to the lands they inhabited under Ottoman rule. The partition of imperial territories did not render these links obsolete overnight. The newly established governments had to manage these links while constructing new state-subject relations in Turkey and the League of Nations mandates in the Arab East. The Treaty of Lausanne played critical roles in this arduous process. As a peace treaty concluded after an imperial collapse, it served not only to end a state of war, but also to address problems of state succession. This was a key aspect of the treaty's role in the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire and merits close attention within frameworks that transcend national and regional divides. State succession in former Ottoman territories remained an ongoing process throughout the 1920s, not only in Turkey, but most notably also in the empire's so-called Arab provinces, where Ottoman bureaucratic and military presence had in the course of World War I become more extensive than it ever was before. Reference to specific articles will help illustrate how the Treaty of Lausanne played a role in addressing problems of state succession. Some articles in the treaty contributed to addressing these problems by providing a framework for diplomatic interaction. Some prepared the grounds for managing specific problems within particular successor states. Some were useful simply as recognition of agreement on a particular issue. Take, for instance, Article 61 of the treaty, which simply read as follows, quote, "The recipients of Turkish civil and military pensions who acquire under the present treaty the nationality of a state other than Turkey shall have no claim against the Turkish government in respect of their pensions," end quote. Even this article, which does not really solve any problem on its own, is highly significant. Most discussions of the Treaty of Lausanne do not leave much room for thought as to why a peace treaty would need to include an article about pensions. That article was there, however, precisely because the treaty had a role to play in ongoing processes of state succession. It had to contribute to the reconfiguration of relations not only between states, but also between states and their subjects. Considering this connection, also Article 139. This was one of the articles which factored into state succession more positively. Especially after the ratification of the treaty in August 1924, this article provided a regulatory framework for reference to, quote, archives, registers, plans, title deeds, and other documents of every kind relating to the civil, judicial, or financial administration, or the administration of waqfs, end quote, in former Ottoman territories. On the basis of this article, states and former Ottoman subjects engaged in cross-border interactions for reference to Ottoman records for a wide range of purposes. Certification of biographical information, evidencing professional background, and proving ownership of land and property were among these purposes. Article 139 was helpful in meeting some of the most basic administrative needs in former imperial territories. Now, the word helpful is key here because simply the inclusion of relevant stipulations did not guarantee the desired outcomes. The majority of Ottoman records were in Istanbul in the 1920s, and the implementation of this article in post-Ottoman Turkey and the Arab East required negotiations between the Ankara government and the French and British mandate authorities. The significance of the Treaty of Lausanne was produced and reproduced in interactions and negotiations which took place during the implementation of its stipulations. The treaty's vital role in processes of state succession can be observed not only through a couple of articles here and there, but also through some of the most essential articles in the treaty. Consider in this regard Articles 30 to 36 concerning nationality. The Treaty of Lausanne was the definitive peace treaty that officially ended World War I in former Ottoman lands. It was therefore this treaty that legally transformed Ottoman subjects, quote, habitually resident in territory detached from Turkey, end quote, meaning the pre-war Ottoman Empire, into, quote, nationals of the state to which such territory is transferred, end quote. The treaty's ratification in 1924 represented a watershed in a wide range of claims and disputes involving questions of nationality status. 4 years after its ratification, the treaty's nationality-related stipulations remained relevant to the construction of new state-subject relations in post-Ottoman Turkey and the Arab East. A significant example in this regard is what was stipulated in Articles 30 to 36 as the right of option, or option of nationality, hakkı ihtiyar, as we would say. This provided ex-Ottomans, quote, differing in race from the majority of the population, end quote, in a territory detached from the Ottoman Empire, the right to opt for, quote, the nationality of one of the states in which the majority of the population is of the same race, end quote. Despite the small number of confirmed options, which seem to have remained below 20,000 by the end of the 1920s, these stipulations factored into intense political competition in especially areas near the present-day border between Turkey and Syria. Furthermore, claims and disputes involving option of nationality forced state authorities to think and rethink about how to categorize the inhabitants of lands under their authority. A focus on the treaty's implementation in the 1920s reveals significant difficulties and disputes in the exercise of option of nationality. This, in turn, allows insights into what nationality meant for ex-Ottoman subjects and how it was claimed and contested in practice. At this point, it will be useful to zoom out from specific articles in order to elaborate on the wider stakes of emphasizing the treaty's role in processes of state succession. This emphasis invites sustained engagement with questions of nationality rather than nationalism. It facilitates analyzing the construction of new state-subject relations at the intersections of administrative, legal, and diplomatic interaction. Essential to these analyses is the interpretation of sources such as petitions, together with internal and diplomatic correspondence of multiple states. Prioritizing these questions and sources facilitates attention to the agency of a diverse body of social actors. In much of the relevant literature, the focus is solely on prominent politicians, military leaders, and intellectuals, in part as a result of reliance mainly on sources such as memoirs, the press, and minutes of debates in conferences and parliaments. Furthermore, tracing the implementation of stipulations pertaining to state succession can foster new agendas of transnational and transregional research. The dismantling of the Ottoman Empire left traces in sources that are now housed in a multiplicity of cities around the world, due in no small part to the involvement of multiple empires in the process. These cities include, but are not limited to, Istanbul, Paris, London, Ankara, Beirut, Nantes, and New Delhi. Cross-fertilizing multiple types of sources in different collections around the world can be of great value in critically engaging with historical trajectories and spheres of relevance that are often assumed to be separate. This is essential for moving beyond what we may call compartmentalization of historical significance. Key instances of wartime and post-war diplomacy in the Middle East seem to have acquired their separate spheres of relevance. Just as, for example, the Hussein-McMahon correspondence or Balfour Declaration feature rarely in studies and popular notions about Turkey's Ottoman past, scarce attention is paid to the Treaty of Lausanne in narratives on the making of the post-Ottoman Arab East. Despite important revisions in recent years, national frames continue to compartmentalize histories of this period. In addition, there is a degree of thematic compartmentalization of significance in studies focusing on selected aspects of the Treaty of Lausanne and the conferences that led to it. This type of compartmentalization does not necessarily prevent scholars from fruitfully transcending national and regional divides in order to examine a wide range of historical events and processes. Examples would include studies on large-scale demographic change, such as the population exchange between Turkey and Greece, territorial disputes, such as the Mosul dispute, or intercommunal relations, such as those involving minorities, among many others. Examples can be multiplied. However, an emphasis on the treaty's role in intertwined processes of state succession represents a more holistic approach to the fundamental and pervasive nature of the treaty's significance across former Ottoman territories in the 1920s. This wider perspective can be useful in developing constructive criticism of reductionist binaries in some portrayals of the Treaty of Lausanne. Especially in contemporary Turkey, popular debates on the treaty often resemble a clash of two main positions, one arguing the treaty to be a complete victory against imperialist powers, the other arguing it to be a disastrous defeat that surrendered on the table the rights defended by the nation on the battlefield. This victory versus defeat binary has been criticized on multiple occasions by now. Yet the criticism often takes the form of a thinly qualified neither this nor that approach. There is still the need for positive suggestions as to what then can be fruitful explanatory approaches to making historical sense of the Treaty of Lausanne. This discussion has highlighted the use of approaching the treaty in terms of its role in the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire with a focus on its role in managing state succession. Among the reasons why this is a useful approach is the attention it draws to processes that continued throughout the 1920s. This represents a refreshing contrast with fixation on what larger political meaning the treaty symbolized at the time of its signing in July 1923. Due attention to the treaty's role in long and multifaceted transitions will facilitate nuanced interpretation of how the treaty was assessed by esteemed political leaders who paved the path for its signing. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, İsmet İnönü, and Rauf Orbay, among others, evaluated the treaty not necessarily in terms of a binary of victory or defeat, but more as a stage that had to be secured in struggles they considered likely to continue in the years to come. Last but not least, approaching the Treaty of Lausanne in the wider context of the dismantling of the Ottoman Empire can help us see beyond just struggles between opponents who had conflicting interests on every question. The treaty played a stabilizing role in relations between Turkey and the mandatory powers in Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, i.e. France and Britain. The state authorities in these neighboring countries shared the agenda of dismantling the Ottoman Empire as rapidly and efficiently as possible. This may not sound so enchanting if we are content with studying history solely through binaries of imperial ambitions versus national resistance. But the need to manage links to the Ottoman past in the 1920s generated negotiation and cooperation, as well as competition and contestation across the new borders. Contextualizing the Treaty of Lausanne in terms of its role in steering state succession can facilitate attention to what needed to be done with others rather than solely against them. This ultimately can help us avoid uncritical reliance on antagonism when explaining the past and present. With these, I conclude my words. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Orçun. So at this point, I would like to leave the word to Professor Eugene Rogan to open up the discussion.
Merve, thank you very much. And it's such a pleasure to be taking part in today's panels. I'd like to extend my thanks to Burak, to Andrew, and to Orçun for sharing their research with me, because it is innovative and it's exciting. And they're each going in important new directions around a critical crossroad period in modern Middle Eastern history that brings together the ideologies and cross-national networks that lie at the heart of the topic for today's panel. And I found the three papers cohered as a result very naturally around some key themes, which I'd like to explore in the course of my comments following these three great presentations. And I guess the first observation, to state the obvious, is that after 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire did not fall quietly. The echoes reverberated around the successive states of the Middle East and Turkey itself for years following the end of the First World War. And what emerges at the state level as a brutal rupture, there is no doubt that the partition of the Ottoman Empire into at least 7 new states, 5 of them under European mandate rule, proved a tremendous rupture at the state level. But at the societal level, the continuities are in many ways more striking and more significant across Turkey and the successor states. Elites, education, administrative practices, religious institutions, they all showed strong Ottoman influences for years after the First World War, fading only slowly under the dual challenges of the local nationalisms that emerged in the successive states of Syria or Iraq or Palestine, as well as the broader pan-Arab nationalism that challenged nationalism within narrower nation-state boundaries. And I think this question of an Ottoman twilight extending long into the 1920s has been brought to light by recent scholarship by people like Michael Provence and Cyrus Shaikh in ways that are really relevant to the discussion that we're having today. These essays and the panel each capture an aspect of this moment of transition. Andrew Hammond picks up on a British request for an authoritative account of Islam for the post-First World War world. And it's worth bearing in mind that at the time the request first comes through in 1918, it was still an Ottoman context. And in that sense, the Sultan was still the Caliph, and in that sense, Istanbul still could present itself as the capital of the Sunni Muslim world. But Islam had already emerged in the Ottoman context as a transnational community. And Hammond's paper reveals a network of scholars whose connections were established in the Ottoman Empire's Islamicate intellectual and administrative institutions. As Hammond demonstrates in his doctoral research, that network long survives a transition from the Ottoman Empire to the Turkish Republic, as is covered in this paper, especially in the partnership between Abdulaziz Jawish and Mehmet Akif, when both turned their backs on the Kemalist Republic in favor of monarchical Egypt. So we see the kind of transnational ideological and administrative and educational networks that bound Turkey to Egypt and of course to a broader Islamicate world that was to prove very influential in the post-Ottoman reality. Now, of course, Islam was not the only rival intellectual tendency to the Turkish nationalism that we would later call Kemalism in the early 1920s. As Hammond noted, Butwood's original request for an authoritative brief on Islam was in part motivated by his and by Great Britain's concern for the impact of communism on Ottoman Turkey after the Bolshevik Revolution. Again, one has to bear in mind that even pre-war Arabists were genuinely concerned about a bid for independence from the Ottoman context for fear of European colonial aspirations in their territory. So before the First World War, arguably, even Arabists would have been arguing for remaining in the Ottoman context. In the post-Ottoman world, looking at the kind of maneuvering that Britain and France were engaging in, the message coming from Bolshevik Russia was very reassuring. The disavowal claims to territory beyond Russia's frontiers meant that the communists would have had an appeal to partisans in the Arab world, as in Turkey, that would have really been encouraged by the fears of the colonial solution that was taking root at that moment. And as Burak Sayın demonstrates, Marxism in that way really made an effort to shape the post-Ottoman world and the Middle East in particular. Drawing on Russian state archives, further proof, if we needed it, of the importance of Russian archives to modern Middle Eastern studies, Burak documents work among the cadres of an Ankara-based People's Communist Party of Turkey to promote communism in neighboring Syria, Iraq, and what Burak terms the resilience of radical ties forged in the late Ottoman era. These ties are exemplified in the life and work of Tehif Central Committee candidate. I don't know whether he ever actually got elected to the Central Committee, Mehmet Hasib, who was raised in Damascus by a father exiled for his opposition politics in the Hamidian era, and moved between Syria and Turkey, preserving a wide network across the successor states of the Ottoman Empire. The choice of target territories for his agitation and propaganda work reflected the endurance of Ottoman networks as well. Egypt, Iraq, Hijaz, and Palestine were very much part of a post-Ottoman Arab world. Other centers of Tehif activity included Mosul and Mersin, given its proximity to Aleppo, connecting Anatolian communities with Iraq and Syria. The Communist Party encouraged national liberation movements. Again, it would be a first step towards the ultimate internationalism of Soviet communism, and activism against the French and the British, drawing such leading figures as Sheikh Sanusi from Libya and Amir Shakib Arslan from Mount Lebanon into a network of activists who turned to the Soviet and communist models as ways to try and combat the threat of imperialism that was taking root in the region. Communism, like Islamic culture, drew on intra-imperial ties established at the end of the Ottoman Empire and survived the breakup of the Ottoman Empire under a new transnational form. That shift from imperial to transnational form was formalized in the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, the subject of Orçun Can Orkan's paper. Here again, Orçun argues that the partition of imperial territories did not render links between inhabitants of former Ottoman domains obsolete overnight. The Treaty of Lausanne was designed in part to smooth the process of succession to the state system. Orçun's paper follows the process of what he terms state succession. It's an expression that crops up regularly in his paper. After the intensification of bureaucratic and administrative connections forged under the total warfare of World War I. I mean, something that Hasan Kayalı has argued, and it's good to see Hasan joining us for the panel today, the importance of the First World War period in actually binding an Ottoman community through bureaucratic and administrative and legislative action. And I think in this sense, the First World War stands a period where arguably Anatolia and the Arab provinces were more intensely bound together than ever before. At the administrative level, continuity was achieved through Article 139, highlighted in Orçun's paper, giving former Ottomans in the Arab successor states access to the deeds and documents as required by bureaucratic devolution, such as in matters of land ownership. And even today, Ottoman-era land registers are preserved by the governments of successor states in Lebanon, in Syria, in Jordan, perhaps even in Iraq, I don't know. It's not clear if they were transferred as a result of Article 139 back to the successor states, or whether in fact they'd simply never left Damascus and Aleppo and Amman and Baghdad. But either way, these books and other examples of the Ottoman administrative bureaucracy proved a basis of continuity in the bureaucratic culture of the Ottoman Empire as transferred to the successor mandate states. I think Orçun's essay is particularly useful in reappropriating the Treaty of Lausanne in the Arab world and not limiting its impact or influence to that of the emergence of the Republic of Turkey. So the broader relevance of the treaty to Iraq and Syria is something he highlights, and I think means that those of us who work on the Arab territories should probably go back and reread the treaty to think about the relevance it had for resolving outstanding issues in this transformation from Ottoman to states, or state succession, again, using Orçun's expression. So the Treaty of Lausanne, thus, is a key document in the long Ottoman twilight in the region as a whole. Now, I can see that we have 2 questions already on the question bar, and I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of Zeynep Çelik to encourage all of you in our audience, amazing knowledge and expertise that you collectively represent, to take a moment to add a question to the bar. But to get the Q&A session going, I'd like to pose one question to each of our panelists. Andrew, given Butwood's request for an authoritative guide on Islam had stalled in your analysis, could you explain why the secular Mustafa Kemal should have revived the idea of drafting such a brief text in 1922? And does that in some way suggest that Mustafa Kemal envisioned a different role for Islam in the Turkish Republic in 1922 than he would impose by, say, the 1924 abolition of the Caliphate? Burak, in Andrew's paper, Butwood quoted saying, "Lenin has friends in every land." And I'd like to know, in your research in the Russian archives, what light do the Russian documentary sources shed on this for Turkey and the Arab lands in the early 1920s? Really, to what extent were people in the Arab world and in Turkey drawn to the Leninist vision that was being realized in Soviet Russia? And Orçun, while Lausanne is essential for this transition from imperial to the state system or state succession, one area of uncertainty that is fundamental to the principle of stateness is, of course, that of boundaries. And one can say that that remains one element of the Treaty of Lausanne that was unfinished work, certainly looking at Hatay in terms of treaty relations with Syria. And of course, the Mosul question remained unresolved by 1923. So how were the frontier issues dealt with in that element of state succession in the Treaty of Lausanne. If I could ask Andrew, Burak, and then Orçun in that order to give us brief answers, hopefully we'll have more questions for you in the Q&A bar. Zeynep Hanım, I hand the floor back to you, and thank you all.
Yeah, thank you. Well, absolutely, this is the key question, but there has been much debate about Mustafa Kemal's intentions. I think from the material that from Jawish's the archive material of Jawish and his memoirs, and the way this played out with this book project, I think it really strengthens the idea that he was playing with Islamic opinion because there was specifically a problem on the domestic front that he had to deal with. And I think it's things were changing so much on the ground at that time that it's even from 1922 to 1923. I think Shukru Haniolu's made the point that in 1921 there was a certain high point of rhetoric from Mustafa Kemal that was rather socialist in flavor. And in 1922 it shifted to an Islamic flavor, the language that was being used, and that faded out in 1923. Now Jawish is brought to Istanbul in late 1922. By the summer, things have soured. And he knew around October, September of 1923 that he was leaving. And as it appears in his memoirs, he sensed from the very beginning that there was another intent entirely. Now, why would there be such a desire to have to play to Islamic opinion? I think it goes back to the fact that there had actually been, and it's easy to forget, two rival governments for 3 years, from 1920 to 1922. These were absolutely two rival authorities. And many people left Istanbul and went to Ankara because they lost faith in what the Sultan's government was saying and doing, and they believed in what Mustafa Kemal's forces were doing. And I think the very practical problem was, where are the loyalties and allegiances of the Anatolian peasantry? And they thought, even if they were fighting for Mustafa Kemal's forces in 1920, 1921, 1922, they thought they were fighting for the Sultan in some ways. They thought they were fighting for Islamic causes, and which doesn't show through much in the intellectual debate that follows in the early Turkish Republic, but it does come up in very interesting ways, say in literature, where you have that novel Yaban by Yakub Kadri Kara Osmanolu, where he very clearly shows that the peasantry they had a rather negative view in many ways of the national forces, and they had a very positive view of the Sultan. So I think when it gets to 1922, you have this point where Ankara is assuming control in Istanbul, it's entering into Lausanne, it has won the war against the Greeks. There's a desire to, there's a need to have to deal with Islamic opinion. And I think that this book project was a very opportune way of doing that. So I think that's what we.
So about the question, well, I think the expression is actually quite correct in that it says, Lenin has a lot of friends in all lands, because the communism as communist parties in the region, in a lot of countries, actually was quite a late comer. I mean, I talked about Syria, the actual formation of a communist party, even a small communist party, was not possible until 1925. In a lot of other countries, other examples as well. I mean, this is true in Algeria. You do have contacts with the French Communist Party, but not an actual communist organization in itself until quite late. But other than that, there's quite a bit of attention to the Comintern project as an anti-imperialist and anti-colonial hope in a way. I mean, I think it's quite significant as we are talking about, the Russian archives. The very first entry about the Syrian Communist Party in these archives is not related to anything communist, but it's a letter coming from an organization which is calling itself Les Jeunes Musulmans, the young Muslims, and contacts the Communist International and not a communist party to link their projects with them. So in that sense, I think you can talk about a lot of anti-colonial and nationalist movements coming towards an uneasy alliance with the global communist project. I mean, the examples are all over the Middle East. You have the Rif Rebellion in Morocco, and Abdul Karim has ties with, has a contact with the Communist International. In Algeria, you have Emir Khaled, which is practically working for the Communist International at one point. You have Sheikh Talbi in Tunisia, even in the publication of his most important work, which is like quite significant for the Tunisian nationalism even right now, La Tunisie Martyre, the logistics of the the logistic, how to say, infrastructure of the French Communist Party is of essence. In Egypt, I mean, it's not, it's a bit of an exception, as there's not much of a contact with Zaghloul and his organization, but with Hizbul Watani, the contacts are quite tight. I mean, you can expand that to Turkey, to Syria, and this actually affects the very essence of Middle Eastern communism as well. This is one of the arguments that I make in my dissertation. In Europe and in the Western world, you have communist parties which come to being as splits from the socialist parties, and as a result of that, which is in a competition with other socialist and social democratic parties in a working class ground, trying to outdo their opponents on this class politics ground. In Middle East, often the militants of the communist parties, they did come from anti-colonial backgrounds, and as a result of that, they are in a way competing in a national play field. They are trying to outdo their opponents as a national anti-colonial political entities. So this actually changes the whole essence of Middle Eastern communism as well. I mean, if this is an answer.
Yeah, and also thank you so much for your comments and questions. You're absolutely right in the sense that there was much that was still to be done after the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne, and even after the ratification of the Treaty of Lausanne, right? Mosul settled only in mid-26, but there was still much to be done. Hatay, only towards the end of the interwar period can we really talk about steps towards the statu quo that was established before World War II. I think this is a crucial point to keep in mind, precisely that need to contextualize the Treaty of Lausanne, not at that very moment of its signing, but in the broader context of the 1920s, so that we make sense of it in broader temporal and spatial frameworks. Even beyond these questions about boundaries, I think you can observe the importance of this point, even in the context of the articles that I focused on. Article 139, for example, there were stipulations there, but still negotiations were necessary in order to reach understandings about how to actually do that work that would secure access for people who needed it. You mentioned the case of Iraq, for example. In 1926-27, officials from Iraq have in fact come to Istanbul to make copies of title deeds and so on, and took copies back, and apparently these were very useful. The British mentioned it in their reports to the League of Nations. But with the French mandate authorities, things worked differently. Rather than a large delivery of these documents on large scale at once, it appears that throughout the years, specific requests were made for specific records number of times. So yeah, different paths were followed in relation to different questions. And it wasn't as if a treaty signed in 1923 brought an immediate solution to everything. So it's definitely worth keeping in mind, this larger temporal framework, I think.
Thank you. So maybe we should start the Q&A session right now. We have a question from Michael Battaglia. This is a question for Orçun. So did you find that the Treaty of Lausanne had any influence on the politics of Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf region, especially considering that the Ottoman Caliphate remained the spiritual custodian of the two holy mosques until 1924?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much for this question. I have to say that my research for the dissertation focused on these three neighboring polities. So I would love to learn more about the influence the Treaty of Lausanne had on the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf region in more specific terms. I would seek answers to this question by focusing on that less than a year period between the signing of the treaty and the abolition of the caliphate from July 1923 to March 1924. That would be the period that I would investigate more closely, let's say, through newspapers or through other sources, to get a sense of how the Treaty of Lausanne is received in that part of former Ottoman territories. This is something for me to think more about. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question for you, Orçun, from James Ryan. He says that this was really interesting. So, so he appreciates what you said about not the framing of Lausanne as a victory or defeat and the political purposes that that framing serves. But I also wonder about the domestic political function that the treaty did serve, most explicitly in its revision to general amnesty to exempt the list of 150 yüzeylilikler. Is there a peril too in framing the treaty narrowly as a pragmatic, security-focused agreement, particularly given how much opposition was crushed in the preceding years in the name of security against external and internal threats to the regime? I think this is an important balance to strike here.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is an important point. At times, the Treaty of Lausanne is contextualized only with attention to domestic dynamics within Turkey. At times, it is contextualized only through examination of maybe international relations, broader geopolitics. I'm trying to strike a balance in terms of how the treaty was instrumental in reconfiguring relations between states, as well as between states and their subjects. And the political aspect that James Ryan is pointing to is, I think, certainly valuable. The process leading to the ratification of the treaty in the assembly, and then obviously its aftermath. But before the ratification, the elections. All these are, I think, are highly valuable, interlinked episodes to think together. James, I think the question is right. There is a balance to be struck here. I hope I can strike a fine balance in this regard in my work.
Oh, so just because you mentioned about how Lausanne, is also important to, regulate relations between the state and the society. So maybe I can take from there, because I have a question about that too. Just because you mentioned about nationality and citizenship, I mean, in the late Ottoman period, it's citizenship itself is very instrumental for claim making, and it's incidental. It's an instrument for legal jockeying in resolving disputes about many different issues over property or inheritance. But then when you read the court records, there's often quite a sophisticated understanding of citizenship as a legal term. So I was wondering to what extent the Lausanne Treaty, if at any rate, came into the everyday vocabulary of people for claim making in the post-Ottoman Middle East. In terms of going to the courts. Was it sort of a platform for making claims over various issues?
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Mary. I think one of the perhaps benefits or potential uses, let's say, of focusing on specific stipulations and disputes that relate to those stipulations, I think, is that they gave you at least opportunities to see how people raised certain claims pertaining to nationality in circumstances where there is something at stake, like land and property, or like retirement pension, or some kind of expectation in legal terms. I think these are particularly promising types of interactions that one would maybe investigate in order to get a sense of what nationality meant to former Ottoman subjects while that transition was taking place. In my opinion, thinking about material interest, thinking about security concerns of states, how those links about subjecthood is the word I very much used in the narratives that I try to construct. The more a historical inquiry focuses on what was at stake for the people who were making a claim about their nationality, I think the greater our chances of understanding the changing meanings of tabiyet at that particular moment of nationality and subjecthood, in my opinion.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Orçun. And I think
could I follow up here? One issue that crops up when one talks about transnational ideologies, and in both Islam and in communism, we have two that have been very influential in 20th century Middle Eastern history, is the argument that Islam always found fertile ground because the language of Islam was built into culture and society. Communism always had this difficult boundary to cross in communicating the ideology of communism in ways that could be picked up on by common people, workers, peasants in the Arab world and in Turkey. And I wonder whether Andrew and Burak could reflect a little bit on the respective places of communism and in Islam in engendering a kind of political platform at this time of state transition.
What comes to mind that I've seen is that it's interesting to me how intellectuals, many across the spectrum, I mean, going from people we would call Islamists to someone like Ziya Gökalp, who actually was very concerned with Islamic issues and did not think of himself at all as being kind of anti-Islam in any sense like that. But both of them did not think that communism was a big concern. They thought it was possible for Turkey or the state in whatever form to have some kind of relationship without that being a threat to the social construct of Turkish society. And I think that the interesting thing is that where they come from with that is the idea that the arrangement of Turkish society or Anatolian society is not class-based in the sense of, the industrialized economies of the time, like Britain, Germany, France, which in a sense is an odd analysis when you look at what happened. The one country where the revolution happened was Russia, which was not, a great industrial power like the others, and was not where Marx even himself would have predicted that revolution would have happened. But they had this view that there was not some great threat from communism as an ideology. And in fact, it seems from what I see with the Islamist writers, there's kind of they seem to quite enjoy talking about Bolshevism as something they don't take seriously. which I always found quite interesting. Because, I mean, there has been quite a bit of research in recent years about the industrialization of Ottoman society at the time in the late Ottoman period. And I think the way they were looking at things was rather naive, to be honest. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that strikes me.
I mean, thank you for the question. By the way, actually, picking up from where Andrew left, actually, well, the communism obviously was starting from a new ground. I mean, there was no like based important socialist parties in these countries to split from or anything. But actually, we see a lot of flexibility in the communist politics in the region to adapt to conditions, and as a result of that there is actually kind of a dialogue with Islam, and even a sort of political Islam, one might say. I mean, especially in early 20s, they are even in the eastern section of the Communist International, they are even toying with the idea of establishing a caliphate under their influence, and Sunusi is actually the most likely candidate for them, because I mean, I mentioned that they had contact, and actually through the Ankara government the contact was quite tight, and in a lot of countries they do use an Islamic language quite freely. Actually, in Istanbul, for example, it must be the May Day demonstrations of 1922. They do distribute leaflets which call the mujahids of the world revolution to fight for their liberation, and the Communist International itself calls for the restitution of Istanbul, not to the Turks, not to the Ottomans, but to Muslims. And I don't know, for example, in Tunisia as well, you have similar examples. The first Tunisian communists are, brought to a French tribunal for singing and composing a song which freely uses, all kind of Islamic language, and who calls for a fight against, the infidel. So I think this dialogue is something to be think about.
Thank you. I think we don't have any more questions, but maybe if you have other questions or comments to add. Otherwise, Zeynep Hocam, would you have any?
Yeah, I will have some concluding remarks here. First of all, I really would like to thank you very much for your meticulous work. You opened up new areas and left us with a lot of food for thought. In fact, I would argue that what you offered to us is so new that the audience was a little bit concerned about asking you questions. We have to think about these issues, and it's interesting that people felt more familiar, more at ease with the Treaty of Lausanne, which is discussed for forever, whereas the other two areas, even those communism, Turkish communism, has not been unstudied, but what you offered to us is very new. So forgive our audience for not asking you a lot of questions. It's not from a lack of interest, I believe, but for insecurity about the knowledge base. I may be wrong, but I don't think so. And the way you answered the questions in all three cases, you all demonstrated not only a mastery over your work, but a passion for your work. It came through in your presentations and in your answers, and this is really important. Let me remind everybody that the recording of the session will be available to everybody on YouTube, and that the text will be published in the Journal of Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association in the spring edition, spring 21 edition. So they are stored, they will be stored in an archival manner. So thank you very much, everybody, for taking part in this, and for again and again for your wonderful work. And Professor Rogan for his most intriguing comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you.